And when we look at this code, it is so clear where the inspiration came from. It's definitely one of these lacquer objects. What we should not forget about that gown, it was a French design, but it was entirely made in India. Sardozi is a very old embroidery tradition. When we look into this 2012 collection, it becomes even more clear how much Lagerfeld researched the arts and traditions of the country. Hi, I'm Liz. I'm a fashion and art historian, and I'm also the owner of the fashion label Pelagona. And on this channel, I'm diving deep into the rich history of garments, their cultural significance, the designers who brought those garments to life, and the interesting stories behind fashion trends. So let's dive into today's topic. I'm going to talk about the so-called Orientalism in Karl Lagerfeld's designs. You may have seen I have done 2 other fashion talks with Madame Faction about Karl Lagerfeld. One was about the Met Gala this year, which had Karl Lagerfeld as the main topic, and the other one was a discussion about the current exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is called Karl Lagerfeld, A Line of Beauty. You can find the links to these discussions in the section below, of course. Before we start with fashion, I would like to talk about the terms Orientalism, Exoticism, Chinoiserie. All of those are labels that were used in the 18th and 19th century for the interest of the European elites with the Far East. There were more labels such as Indian or Chinese for the entire Asian region. Sometimes it even involved the Middle East or Northern Africa. So when we think in today's standards, none of these terms would be correct. Nevertheless, in the 18th and 19th century, these terms were used. And because Karl Lagerfeld had a deep interest in the 18th century, this is also the vision of the East that he had. So what was this trend? The main trend was chinoiserie. It comes from the French word chinois for Chinese. There were a lot of travel reports in the 18th century about China, about the country, about the culture. It was depicted as a very harmonious country, highly cultural, and the emperor was just and fair. So all those who decorated their homes or wore garments that looked Chinese, whatever they understood with it, they showed that they wanted to be as enlightened as that emperor. They showed that they were open-minded, and of course they also displayed their wealth. Why? Because most of these objects were very, very expensive. We are talking about tapestries, porcelain, we're talking about lacquer, which I'm going to cover a bit later. All of these objects were very, very hard to get and very expensive. This trend actually already started in the 17th century. It then spanned across the 18th century and ended at the end of the 18th century. There was a short revival around the Paris Expo in 1867, and this inspired a lot of Art Nouveau artists, or in Austria, the Jugendstil, where a lot of artists and architects incorporated Asian elements into their art and works. So you may now ask, what has this got to do with Lagerfeld? Very easy. He was a very big fan of the 18th century, especially furniture. He had a very big collection of 18th century furniture, and of course this also involved these chinois elements. And similar to the people in the 18th century who could very often not travel to China or India because it was quite a long journey or it was very expensive, he also had not a naive vision of these countries, but let's say rather a poetic vision or a fictional vision of these countries. The earliest examples are actually with Chloé, not with Chanel, because in 1976 Karl Lagerfeld designed 2 dresses. One was called Du Rêve, and it looked like the typical watercolor paintings from China. And the other one is the so-called D'Or dress, made from gold. It's a brown lurex dress with gold details, and this referenced the lacquer furniture. Lacquer furniture was very, very precious, very expensive and very sought after in Europe, and it was another one of these objects that showed how wealthy and open-minded people were. And this actually leads me to another design. In 1996, Lagerfeld designed for the autumn-winter collection, he designed dresses and coats that also referenced these lacquer objects. So we have a dress and a coat which are fully embroidered with sequins, and they have a red base, and then they show scenes from daily life. And where it's even more clear, it is another coat which actually has the dark base coat of lacquer furniture with these gold scenes from Chinese daily life. So let me quickly explain to you this lacquer furniture. The way it was made was very, very expensive because it took a long time. A substance from the lacquer tree was taken, and then very thin layers were painted onto mostly wood or other objects, and then they had to be sanded down, and then another layer came, and it was polished, and it took a very long time, hence it was very expensive. When the whole thing was very dark and polished, the artists painted with gold, or they used inlays to display daily lives from the Chinese elite, from the emperor, and these objects very often served like travel reports in Europe, because you could actually see how people lived in China at that time. And when we look at this coat, it is so clear where the inspiration came from. It's definitely one of these lacquer objects, and we actually know which one, because there is a French cabinet in Gabrielle Chanel's apartment in Rue Cambon. She also collected these chinois pieces of furniture, and this cabinet was made in France, but it imitated the very expensive Chinese coromantel lacquer. This was also nothing uncommon, because the original objects from Asia were so expensive that it was a bit more cost effective to make them in Europe and also use these imitations. And it is very likely that Karl Lagerfeld has seen this French cabinet and that it served as an inspiration for this particular design. What is also very interesting about this coat is that it had an elongated silhouette. Karl Lagerfeld called it the stiletto silhouette, and they were cut really, really tightly. Special bodysuits had to be worn underneath them, and also this coat is again a fusion. It's a Western coat, but you can see that it references the Chinese Gyeongsam dress. It is kind of like a hybrid fashion item. According to Vogue, what was special about this collection in 1996 was also that it was not simple, it was not understated, it was very, very colorful. So we are talking here about very opulent designs, and when we think about opulence, of course we think of India, because there's no one who can do opulence better than the Indians. Of course, India also inspired Lagerfeld, and already for this particular collection in 1996, there are Indian elements. For example, we see a lot of red, we see a lot of pink tones, and we also see a lot of Indian-inspired jewelry or small accessories. According to Vogue, that inspiration comes from the British Raj, because they argue that Lagerfeld for sure knew the gown of the Viceroy of India, Lady Curzon. And this gown was made by Jean-Philippe Worth in France. He designed it, but it was actually made in India with Sardozi embroidery, and it referenced the Mughal throne, which had a lot of gold, a lot of gemstones in it. I'm sure that Lagerfeld knew about that dress. We can see that in some of his designs where he made pantsuits in gold. They were also encrusted with rhinestones, and he also used a grippeur belt with those designs. And it could be a clear reference of that gown. It could just be other references from India, because gold is a very common color. And I also need to contradict Vogue here with this inspiration from the British Raj, because I think Lagerfeld, judging from the research that I have done about him, he probably researched very well the country India itself and the many facets it had. I'm sure he knew about the gown, but even if the gown served as an inspiration, what we should not forget about that gown, it was a French design, but it was entirely made in India. Sardozi is a very old embroidery tradition that came to India from Persia, so there's nothing much British about it except for the wearer. So I do think also when we look into his later designs or later collections, we see very clearly how well he actually tried to research the country. Lagerfeld displayed his passion for foreign countries or Orientalism in the Métiers d'Art collections. These are annual collections where Chanel pays tribute to the craftspeople behind the brand. And in 2012, he called it Paris Bombay, and he traveled or let everyone travel in their minds to India. What is interesting about him is that similar to Yves Saint Laurent, he never traveled to many of the countries that served as an inspiration for him. And I even have a quote here for you. He said, "It is much more inspiring not to go to places than to go." He also said, "India for me is an idea. I know nothing about the reality, so I have a poetic vision of something that is perhaps less poetic in reality." So he admitted that this was not a realistic view of India, it was his imagination. And what we know from Lagerfeld is that he loved to host great parties. He loved to think about all the design elements, also the interior design of the parties and the runway shows. So for this 2012 Paris Bombay runway show, he hosted it at the Grand Palais, and he had a Maharaja's palace built as he imagined it to be, and the guests were sitting at a banquet and then watched all the designs coming by on the runway. When we look into this 2012 collection, it becomes even more clear how much Lagerfeld researched the arts and traditions of the country, because we see a lot of elements. We see block print, sometimes even in very traditional designs. I saw some gloves with Indian embroidery. Of course, there were elements like the typical head pieces for women or the turbans for men. But he tried to give a view of India which was on the one hand traditional, with traditional crafts, traditional art, and he kind of mixed it with the typical Chanel elements. So very often we see the typical tweed, we see the pearls, but these pearls may be in an Indian-inspired jewelry piece, or the headpiece is mixed with such a coat. So this is the more mixed version, but then he also made designs that were kaftan-like dresses or sari dresses. And this brings me to one of the most iconic pieces of that collection. It's a sari dress in white, and it is draped like the typical sari. He pays tribute to this long garment, but he mixed it with a narrow dress, which had a special collar, which is called Nehru collar. It goes back to the politician Nehru in India, who used to wear jackets with a stand-up collar. So this sari dress is again a mix of some Western silhouette, but also clearly Indian elements, apart from like the details that were very Indian. And again, it was interesting because it was nothing new. Chanel already did a sari dress in 1939, where it is assumed that Lagerfeld knew the sketch for this design. And also already in the 1920s, she did some pantaloon designs that were Indian inspired. In the 1950s, she used lame and brocade fabric. So clearly, either it was his own inspiration by the country or also this inspiration of Chanel, where he saw some elements that he then picked up in 2012 again. According to Vogue, this collection served as a reminder that a lot of the Parisian fashion houses or haute couture houses outsource a lot of their production to India, especially for intricate and elaborate garments to save costs. and Vogue applauded Lagerfeld because what he did was that the Indian looking items were actually made in the Paris ateliers. I would have found it an even better move if he had collaborated with artisans in India and if he had given them credit, because in the end it is a design that comes from India, the knowledge is in India, the tradition still lives in India. And if you want to make such a statement, I think this would have even been a more powerful move than this subtle gesture that he did. Bombay was not the only destination where the Métiers d'Art collections traveled to. In 2004, Lagerfeld took us to Paris, Tokyo, and in 2009 it was Paris, Shanghai, and the runway show took place on a 10-meter long barge in the Huang River. For 2018-19, Lagerfeld traveled to another fictional destination. It was ancient Egypt. Again, it shows this mindset of the 18th century. Orientalism also covers Northern Africa, or maybe he was just fascinated by ancient Egypt. We have some designs here that referenced clear Egyptian garments, like the loincloth that men wore, or also the color series. This is a garment that women wore, and it is very often depicted in the hieroglyphs. So what can we say in conclusion about Orientalism in Karl Lagerfeld's designs? I think it really reflects that foreign countries still serve as a major source of inspiration long after the 18th century. I also found it interesting how Lagerfeld mixed all the traditions. So he took local garments, traditions, techniques, and mixed them with Western elements, or he adapted the garments for the needs of the West. What is very important to think about is that we should not forget the historic context and the cultural significance of these garments. These garments come from certain cultures, and I think if inspiration is taken from these cultures or countries, it should be explained what the garment is, where did it come from, and why was it a source of inspiration, and also who is behind the garments. Furthermore, I think we need to do more than just producing certain items then in Paris or in Europe. I would like to see more fashion houses collaborating with the artisans at eye level, to give them credit, to pay them fair wages for their knowledge and for their work and their effort, because also without those people, these beautiful garments, these beautiful traditions would have disappeared by now, and then also Western designers would not be could not be inspired by them. So I do hope that maybe Lagerfeld's Orientalism is a step into a future where more of these collaborations at eye level happen. And I don't know if this is my optimistic hope or wish for the future, but I do hope that you enjoyed this brief trip to foreign countries with me. If you did, I would appreciate if you could like and subscribe. You can also check out more on thepinklookbook.com, where I write about fashion and sustainability. And I hope to see you soon again here on my channel. Goodbye.